Now we're going to move into digital or IP telephony. IP telephony is a two-way transmission media using voice over IP. Now, voice over IP is a subset of the broader category of IP telephony. IP telephony includes many other technologies. It's a whole family of technologies. Voice over IP is one subset of that. Voice over IP is encoding analog communications, your voice, which is an analog media, if you will, encoding that into digital packets, dropping that onto your IP network and communicating that information through the IP network to the destination, where that data is then pulled back out of the packet and translated back into analog voice so that the recipient can hear your voice. This is implemented to provide higher quality of service, and it also helps to reduce the cost of long-distance telephone calls. Voice over IP is a packet switch technology. Remember, with PSTN, we had circuit switching where we would switch in specific pairs of wires that would be your connection from sender to recipient. With voice over IP, these IP packets get sent into the cloud of routers between source and destination. Packet 1 might go this way, packet 2 goes that way, packet 3 goes a different way. No two packets aren't necessarily follow the same path. As a result, these packets can arrive at the destination out of order. So they have to be logged with sequence numbers so that the recipient knows how to piece these back in the proper order so that they can play in a continuous data stream. Voice over IP networks experience two serious problems. One is called jitter, the other is called latency. Latency is the delay from the time you speak until it actually gets fully transmitted to the recipient. Jitter is interruptions within that data stream for, let's say, a packet that gets lost in transit. So two different types of problems that go along with voice over IP, jitter and latency. Higher quality systems that include quality of service controls such as MPLS can help to minimize those types of problems. Another side note to remember about voice over IP is that it is currently not regulated by the FCC, since you're not propagating radio frequency information into the airwaves. These days, many companies use a combination of old analog systems as well as the new digital voice over IP systems. Very often, you'll have a mix of these two components together. We'll be looking at IP phones. We'll be looking at PCs that can be turned into telephones themselves, voice servers. We'll then be looking at an IP private branch exchange. We'll look at media gateways. The concept here of gateway is a device that translates from one protocol type to another protocol. So the term gateway means a translation of protocols, and we'll be looking at that more specifically related to voice over IP. And then we'll look at IP and time domain multiplexing, or TDM, trunk lines. So as I indicated, the concept of a gateway is a device that translates from one protocol to a different protocol. And in voice over IP, this is still fairly new technology. There's different manufacturers with different standards and different technologies implemented. And so what we'll need to do for the time being is have a device that will translate between these various different sets of protocols relative to communicating voice data over your IP network. In this diagram, we see the VoIP system on the left and a gateway and gatekeeper towards the center. Now, those gateways, and you see them on both sides there, those gateways are there to translate between the analog PSTN and the voice over IP on the private portion of the network, and they also translate between the internet component, or bridge if you will, from gateway to gateway, from the internet portion into the private voice network. Remember, over the internet we'd be using encryption technology as well to secure our transmission data over the internet. So those gateways, in addition to translating the protocols, are probably also VPN servers in addition. Voice over IP, voice over frame relay, and voice over ATM. They all use what's called an isochronous process to reduce delays. And this means they are flagged and serialized as high priority, high quality of service, perhaps using MPLS if the routers support MPLS, and also are flagged as far as how to reassemble them in the proper order. There are many vulnerabilities related to IP telephony. They are subject to all the attacks that our information systems networks are subject to. All of our administrative components must be secured with strong authentication. If the network goes down, of course, our data transmission doesn't happen. There's the reselling of long-distance services. That's a possibility. If someone can connect to your IP network, they can listen in on the phone calls. That's assuming you're not encrypting those IP transmissions. We can always denial of service any of the devices. In other words, just flood the gateways and other devices on the system so that they can't handle legitimate inbound frames. And I also can use these devices as paths into your data network. So if I can dial in and spoof or pretend that this is a true voice telephone call, realizing my voice data is now commuting on your data network, I can now start to launch data attacks or attacks on that data network as well. So this is yet another path that a bad guy has to connect into your wires on the corporate network. In order to secure the voice over IP network, you'll probably need to purchase additional protective devices such as a VoIP intrusion detection system and intrusion protection system. This generally is also a VPN server that would provide encryption from one point to another point, perhaps between branch offices in your organization. So when you're looking at a voice over IP system, recognize the need for additional security devices for the VoIP components. So what should we do? First, there should always be firewalls to help secure the entire network. In addition, we just saw the need for additional specific voice over IP intrusion detection, intrusion protection, and encryption for the voice over IP packets. They need to be monitored. You need to download the signatures. You need to understand what the attack types look like. You should also monitor the content whenever possible. In other words, know who's talking to whom, when, why. Are they legitimate phone calls, or has my system been compromised and now I'm sponsoring phone calls from anybody the bad guy cares to sell my data lines to. I should always be encrypting the data anytime it's crossing public or untrusted wires. Provide strong authentication. That's two-factor and mutual authentication. Now, two-factor authentication means the client would provide something he knows, something he has, and or something that he is to authenticate. Don't just rely on a single password. Passwords are easy to crack, and passwords are also easy to be compromised. In other words, somebody writes it down, I found the piece of paper you wrote it down on. Require two-factor authentication. You also need the guy's smart card or swipe card or thumbprint. Now we have strong authentication and we can validate that the guy that's making the phone call is really an authorized dialer. Limit the number of phone calls through the media gateways. It's perhaps not so much limit, but control, restrict, know who they are, and in addition, disable. If we don't have business in Afghanistan, don't authorize phone calls to Afghanistan. Specifically deny them. So that's really the nature of limiting. Is any areas where you should not be dialing, disable the dialing to those areas. And then, of course, always ensure that your telephone calls, when they terminate, get truly disconnected. There's a particular attack called between the lines attack. From the time one person hangs up until the circuit is actually dismantled or the connection is dismantled. A bad guy can step into this now, into this open line in that moment in between the time one guy hangs up until the connection gets broken. A guy can step into that moment and acquire access to the telephone system. Another aspect of incorporating voice over IP is the potential use for IP telephones. And these are wireless devices that can be used throughout your organization wherever you have wireless coverage. And these are, again, mobile devices, so that the clients using these IP handsets can roam about the facility using their telephone, their IP telephone, and appear connected to the LAN at all points in time. There are many security issues related to these IP telephones. First off, they're very often not inventoried well. In other words, they get purchased, they get issued, and we lose track of who we issued them to. So at the point of termination, we very often forget to acquire them back. In addition, one of our employees loses one, and now we've got a bad guy sitting out in the parking lot that's using our free telephone system and may be able to connect to the data portion of the network as well using these telephones. So we have to keep a solid inventory on these, know where they are at all times, and educate the users that if and when they ever get lost, to report it to security as soon as possible. We should also log any events, any anomalies in the way these phones get used, and this should trigger at least a brief investigation, if not a full-fledged investigation on the incident. Only purchase phones with the greatest security features, the latest and greatest. Do your homework on this. This is a rapidly moving target. So learn what the latest technology is. Buy the phones with the latest security technology. Always change the administrator username and password if possible. Always use strong passwords. Only provide those passwords to the top level administrators. Don't let the users be configuring their own devices. Disable remote access features if they're not required. Disallow local configuration. I think I just said that. Don't let the users configure their own telephones. They'll be loading up software that provide vulnerabilities. It might be Trojaned as well, just because they want to play that latest copy of Whack-A-Mole on their PDA. This is a bad thing. Don't let them do that. And also protect the firmware updating process. In other words, only allow administrators to perform that work. The firmware updating process allows the implementation of malicious microcode into the device. Now, this is at the core of the device, and once it's there, it's almost undetectable. The only way you'll ever get rid of it is if and when you actually do the next firmware update. So don't let the users perform those firmware update processes as well. Here we're looking at the different generations of cellular technology related to information services. First generation, or 1G cellular, provided analog services only for voice transmission. There really was no network at that point in time, and users weren't connecting, even using modems back in those days. 2G, or the second generation cellular, is where we finally introduced the 2400 baud modem or the 300 baud modem. They eventually went up to 56K modems in some cases, but these were still using the analog circuit switch connections and the screechy old modems that you dial up. These were on demand. They weren't always on technology, and this was for low data rates. Voice as well as some low data rates. In addition, we had some basic email, paging, and caller ID services on the 2G. We currently are at about generation 2.5. This is where we have some of the ISDN, the DSL technologies that are always on. This is where I have higher bandwidth capabilities for data. I also do voice over this as well. And I also have the email and paging services that we described earlier. That's currently where we live, about generation 2.5. Our target is 3G, third generation. This is where we have truly integrated voice, telephone type of voice, as well as truly integrated network connectivity. And this is on a roaming scale, a globally roaming scale. This is where we're going. So we have very high bandwidth to the PDA. It's a telephone, and it now is using a circuit switch network, it uses a packet switch network, not the circuit switch network of the earlier 2G.